You're watching The Legal Breakdown. So there's a really interesting issue here that I want to discuss. If Donald Trump is convicted in his Manhattan trial, will he be eligible to vote as a citizen of Florida? So we're going to get into that right now, but a quick note to our viewers, Glenn and I are doing daily comprehensive coverage of Donald Trump's criminal trial in Manhattan, so if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. Okay, so Glenn, the question I asked before, if Trump is convicted in this Manhattan trial that's happening right now, will he be eligible to vote in Florida?
You know, interesting is the right word for that one, Brian, and we're going to have to do a quick legal breakdown law school class to puzzle our way through this, and I'm going to answer the question as best I can, but I don't want to bury the lead. It's an open question of law, and we're going to talk about why that is in a minute. So first of all, what do? We look to Florida state law to see what the rules are about when somebody loses their voting rights and when they regain or have their voting rights restored. So under Florida state law, which is where Donald Trump is a resident down at his third-rate resort, Mar-a-Lago, if you are convicted of a crime in Florida, Florida law says after you have served your sentence, after you have completed any period of court supervision, that's probation, parole, after you've paid any fines or restitution that have been imposed, when it's all said and done, then you can have your voting rights restored. But Donald Trump, at least presently, is not being criminally prosecuted in trial in Florida. He's being prosecuted in New York. So then we have to look to the New York law. When does somebody lose their voting rights, and when are those voting rights restored? Under New York state law, once you serve your sentence and you are released from confinement, you are eligible to register to vote again in New York. Now the question becomes, what happens when it's a New York conviction but for a Florida resident? And let me tell you, I have some crack staff members at Team Justice, and we had them call down to both the Florida Office of Clemency and the Florida State Attorney General's office. Here is what we were able to tease out. Even though the law of Florida is as I just described, Florida will look to the law of the jurisdiction in which the conviction occurred. That would be New York, for guidance is what they told us. But we got no definitive answer on the interplay between the two. So let's play this out a little bit. If Donald Trump is convicted in New York, and he will be, based on the evidence we've seen thus far and the evidence we believe to be coming, I think he will be convicted. If he's sentenced to incarceration, he obviously can't vote in Florida. Once he gets out, he would be eligible to vote in New York, but then he would move back down to Florida, and it looks like he would have to coordinate with the Office of Clemency and perhaps even the Attorney General's office in Florida to see if they would be willing to restore his voting rights if he was still on probation. And let me tell you, Brian, any period of incarceration that is imposed after conviction is almost always followed by a long period of probation to make sure the person who's re-entering society doesn't get in more trouble. And if they do, they ordinarily will be revoked on probation and return to confinement. So again, it's an open question, but if it's not murky enough, I need to throw a little something else into the mix, because under Florida state law, if the conviction involves moral turpitude, we're going to talk about what that is, then even under Florida state law, your voting rights are not automatically restored when you're done probation. You actually have to apply to the governor's office. I'm not even going to get into who the governor is in Florida and whether he would do a favor, though, for Donald Trump. Let's stick with moral turpitude right now. I pulled up a recent Florida case that defines how moral turpitude applies in Florida, and it says, quote, moral turpitude involves the idea of inherent badness or depravity in the private social relations or duties owed by man to man, I'm going to update that to say or woman, or by man to society. It has also been defined as anything done contrary to justice, honesty, principles, or good morals. Pretty vague, pretty imprecise. Here is how prosecutors in the criminal justice system generally define moral turpitude. If the crime involves fraudulent conduct, that generally qualifies as a crime of moral turpitude. What is Donald Trump being tried for and likely will be convicted for in Florida? Falsifying business records. That is a crime that involves fraudulent conduct. That's a crime of moral turpitude, and that will make it harder for him to have his voting rights restored in Florida if he makes his way down after he's convicted and serves whatever sentence may be imposed in New York. So I know that is clear as mud, but the reality is, Brian, there are at times no definitive answers to some of the legal questions that we confront. They are what we call questions of first impression. There are no sort of definitive, clear-cut, rock-solid answers. But I hope kind of puzzling through that has at least given our viewers some idea of kind of the parameters, what Trump will be looking at with respect to restoring his voting rights if he is convicted.
Well, Glenn, it sounds like this is especially subjective. So if a Republican official has the final word, can't they just always claim that Donald Trump's crimes don't qualify because they themselves are under his thumb? I mean, you mentioned the governor of Florida. I think Ron DeSantis doesn't want to be the guy while he's trying to appeal to Donald Trump's MAGA base to ensure that the MAGA king doesn't have, his full rights restored.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to say I hate to be cynical, but this is being realistic. It's not being cynical. If he goes back to Florida and there are open questions about whether, for example, his New York conviction constitutes a crime of moral turpitude, the governor could easily swoop in and say, no, it doesn't, and do Donald Trump that favor. And of course, I have absolutely no faith that a guy like Ron DeSantis would be an honest broker of the law or an ethical public servant. He's pretty much proved several times over that he's neither of those things.
Right. And amid all of that, something law and order party. Glenn, even if this conviction in New York doesn't qualify, would the other charges that he's contending with in Florida or DC or Georgia count differently? Are they serious enough to eliminate any kind of ambiguity that the New York convictions might present, because those are dealing with moral turpitude. There's some subjectivity there, but the Florida case, we're talking about stealing classified documents. The DC case, we're talking, blocking the electoral vote certification. These are much more serious crimes.
Yeah, I would agree with that. But I think what we're looking at is the Florida state law. So I think ultimately the Florida state law that talks about having your voting rights restored after you've completed your sentence of incarceration, any period of probation or parole, paid all your fines, paid any restitution that the court has ordered, once that is all cleared up, I don't think the number or nature of the convictions or which jurisdiction ultimately those convictions came from will necessarily guarantee that he will lose his voting rights permanently. I think they will apply Florida state law, hopefully to Donald Trump, the way they apply it to anybody else. But, the moral turpitude piece, there may be sort of a river of moral turpitude crimes running through all of Donald Trump's convictions. And I do think the more convictions he has and the more serious offenses that those convictions represent, I do think it would make it harder for the Office of Clemency or for the governor's office to swoop in and, wipe the slate clean for Donald Trump so he can cast his ballot down in Florida. Heck, he would get down there, and even if he had voting rights, who knows if he would bother, slouching over to the polls to even cast a vote. Right. If it wasn't for him, mind you.
Right, exactly. And I would just note for people, this is an interesting thought experiment that we thought we would do, but really the issue of Donald Trump being held accountable is not whether or not he has voting rights restored, it's whether he's able to stand trial and not be able to evade any accountability by virtue of winning in November. So if you really want to see the guy held accountable for any of his raft of crimes, then our job really is to make sure that we show up at the ballot box in November, that we have a plan to make sure that those around us are able to show up in November to keep this guy out of office so that he doesn't have the levers of power to ensure that he's able to avoid going to trial.
And Brian, let me add one thing, because we've made a lot of progress in the arena of restoring voting rights. Let me give you a minor example. We used to call everybody an ex-con when they came out of prison and returned to society. But many jurisdictions are now saying and calling them formally in their system returning citizens. And frankly, restoring voting rights for all returning citizens is enormously important and consequential. And here's why. Once somebody has served their sentence and they're coming back into society, we want them to be full participants. We want them to bring all of their experiences to bear in who they want to vote for. Maybe they're going to vote for people who actually have an interest in reforming the criminal justice system, in reforming the prison system. So I am a big supporter and proponent of restoring voting rights once somebody who has been convicted of a crime is a returning citizen. And, I think then they should be able to vote and fully participate in society once they, as we say, have paid the debt that they owed to society.
And I'm looking forward to all of those Republicans who suddenly become champions for criminal justice reform the moment that Donald Trump is contending with this exact issue. It's gonna take Donald Trump sitting in a courtroom that's a little chilly for them to suddenly realize that they need to focus on this kind of stuff. It's gonna take Donald Trump sitting in a jail cell to realize that that the conditions in these facilities need to be better. But look, if that's what it takes, trying to make things better for Donald Trump that can benefit the whole system to bring these Republicans on board, so be it. With that said, of course, Glenn and I will continue covering the entirety of this prosecution as it continues to play itself out. For those watching right now, if you want to follow along with our daily comprehensive coverage, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.